All right, so today on the deep dive, we are diving into a mystery that feels like it's straight out of, one of those spy thrillers. We're talking about the Nord Stream pipeline explosions back in September 2022.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. Sifting through all the material you gathered, there are so many different perspectives on what went down in those murky Baltic waters. It's a proper geopolitical puzzle, and the implications, well, they're huge.
No kidding. Just to refresh everyone's memory, Nord Stream 1 and 2, these were basically underwater highways for natural gas, pumping it straight from Russia into Germany, bypassing countries like Ukraine. But here's the thing. Neither of those pipelines was actually operational when those blasts happened. They weren't moving any gas at the time.
But there's no doubt it was deliberate. The sheer force, the magnitude of those explosions, it screamed sabotage. This wasn't some random accident.
Right. Definitely not an accident. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to make sense of the main theories swirling around. Who could have done it, who might have benefited, and what conclusions, official or not, have surfaced since then. It's a real whodunit because even now, in early 2025, after all these investigations by Germany, Sweden, Denmark, nobody's officially pointed a finger at anyone. And that lack of clarity, well, it's only fueled a ton of speculation.
Absolutely. When those official explanations are hard to come by, all those gaps, they tend to get filled pretty quickly with all sorts of theories, some more outlandish than others.
That's for sure. So where should we start with this? Maybe with one of those early reactions that popped up. The idea that Russia might have actually sabotaged its own pipelines. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it gained some traction initially.
It did. Some European officials, especially in Poland, like their prime minister at the time, were pretty quick to suggest it was some sort of Russian provocation, a way to ratchet up tension. The thinking was Moscow wanted to mess with Europe's energy supplies even more, show that nothing was safe. Some even said Russia might try to use the chaos to pressure the West, maybe even try to pin it on Ukraine. The idea, flawed as it is that by showing this kind of vulnerability, they'd scare Europe into backing down, even if it meant sacrificing their own asset.
Hold on a sec. Why would Russia just go and trash a multi-billion-dollar project like that? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
You hit the nail on the head. That's where the logic breaks down for a lot of analysts. The motive just doesn't add up. Blowing up Nord Stream would mean Russia losing a big chunk of leverage over Europe, a huge bargaining chip. It was this economic tool, and poof, gone. Plus, those pipelines were mainly owned by Gazprom, which is basically an arm of the Russian state. To just go and wipe out a $20 billion asset like that, it's just not strategically smart. One Polish commentator even pointed out that Russia just destroyed a major tool they could use for economic blackmail, or even as leverage in a war against Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it's like taking apart your own weapon in the middle of a fight. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. So what did Russia say about all this?
They denied it completely, called the whole thing predictable, stupid, and absurd. And more importantly, there's still no public evidence connecting Russia to those explosions. No Western governments formally accuse them either. So while it was a popular theory early on, the consensus now is that it's mostly speculation. There's no real substance to it.
Okay, so theory one, Russia did it. Not likely. Let's move on to another popular idea, one that's been pushed hard by Russian media and online. The U.S., maybe with some help, was the one behind the sabotage.
Oh, yeah, that one really took off, especially because the U.S. has always been against Nord Stream 2. They saw it as this geopolitical trap for Europe, making them way too dependent on Russian gas.
And didn't Biden himself say something about stopping Nord Stream 2 if Russia invaded Ukraine? That was a big deal back then.
Absolutely. In February 2022, right before the invasion, Biden very clearly said that we will bring an end to Nord Stream 2 if Russia went into Ukraine. That definitely got people thinking that the U.S. had the motive and maybe the means to pull something like this off. Beyond the LNG aspect, destroying Nord Stream would solidify U.S. influence by eliminating a major source of conflict within NATO, removing that dependence on Russia. And the potential benefits for the U.S., pretty obvious. Cut off Putin's power over Europe, and as a bonus, boost the demand for American liquefied natural gas, LNG, over in Europe.
Which, as we'll get to later, is exactly what happened. So how did Russia spin this whole theory?
They went all in on it. As soon as those explosions happened, Russian state media started hinting at some dark, secret American plot. Then, in early 2023, after that Seymour Hersh report came out, they flat out accused the U.S. and Norway of blowing up the pipelines.
Oh, yeah, the Hersh report. That caused a lot of buzz. Yeah. What exactly was he saying?
Hersh claimed that U.S. Navy divers planted explosives during a NATO exercise, and then a Norwegian plane set them off with a sonar buoy. was a super dramatic story, full of details, and proponents of this theory were quick to point out that NATO does drills in the Baltic Sea all the time, so that could have been a cover.
But what evidence did he have to back all that up?
That's the problem. The whole thing relied on one anonymous source. There was no other proof, nothing to support it. And pretty quickly, experts started finding holes in his story. Like the ships and explosives he described didn't match up with any records of naval activity in the area. Both the US and Norway denied everything, called it completely false, pure fiction. One German analyst even said the whole report was full of unproven claims that got way more attention than they deserved.
So not a lot of credibility for that report in the West.
Nope. Most people see it as unverified and based on speculation. But it still gets passed around in Russian media and some of those more fringe circles online. And even beyond Hirsch, the whole idea of the U.S. or NATO being involved, it's still completely unproven. U.S. officials have called it ridiculous.
But what about that tweet from Radek Sikorski, that Polish politician? He just said, "Thank you, USA." That kind of threw gasoline on the fire, didn't it?
Oh yeah, that didn't help. Posting that right next to a picture of the gas leak. Not subtle at all. But later, he said he just thought Nord Stream was a tool for Putin to blackmail Eastern Europe, so getting rid of it was good. But even though Russia used that tweet as proof of Western involvement, Sikorski said he was just expressing his own opinion, not claiming to know who did it. The point is, despite all the speculation in that tweet, there's still zero evidence that the U.S. or any NATO country was behind it. Western governments keep saying it's just a crazy conspiracy theory, but the whole who benefits argument and how much the U.S. hated Nord Stream keeps the theory alive for some people.
So Russia doing it, unlikely. The U.S. doing it, unproven and pretty much dismissed in the West.
Which brings us to our third theory, one that's been getting more attention lately. Maybe it was a Ukrainian group or someone who supports Ukraine. Yeah, as time goes on, the clues seem to point more and more towards Ukraine, suggesting maybe it was individuals, maybe even a special ops unit who were sympathetic to Ukraine, not a big player like the US or Russia. From Kyiv's point of view, taking out Nord Stream for good was a must-do for national security, whoever actually did it.
What kind of clues are we talking about here?
Well, in early 2023, reports started coming out about a yacht that German investigators thought might have been used in the sabotage. A 15-meter sailboat named Andromeda. Apparently, a group rented it in Germany using fake passports, and at least one of them was Ukrainian. This yacht left just a few weeks before the attack, and get this, they found traces of explosives on board.
Wow, that's pretty damning. Did this line up with anything from intelligence agencies?
It did. Around the same time, the New York Times said that U.S. intelligence pointed towards a pro-Ukrainian group as the likely culprits, but they also said there were no Americans or Brits involved. The intelligence suggested it could have been a mix of Ukrainians and Russians who hated Putin. Importantly, there was no evidence linking it directly to Zelensky or the Ukrainian government. But both U.S. and German officials were cautious, saying they hadn't reached a firm conclusion, and Ukraine totally denied it.
So at first it seemed like maybe it was a rogue operation, not something Kyiv ordered.
That's how it looked at first. Then, in June 2023, the Washington Post, citing leaked intelligence, said the U.S. had some advance warning. Apparently, a European ally tipped off the CIA back in June 2022, months before the attack, about a Ukrainian special ops team planning to hit Nord Stream. They shared this with Germany and other allies.
That's a huge reveal. The idea that Western intelligence knew something might be up.
Right. Then, in 2024, the Wall Street Journal published a deep dive with even more specifics. They claimed that a Ukrainian military team actually did it, following orders from a Ukrainian general. Their sources said Zelensky initially okayed a secret plan, figuring it would cut off Russia's war funding, but then supposedly backed out because the U.S. was worried things would escalate. But the WSJ said General Valery Zaluzny, or someone under him, went ahead with it anyway, using a small team that traveled on that Andromeda yacht. And it was apparently funded by private Ukrainian businessmen, no direct help from the West.
That's a really detailed claim and pretty explosive. How did Ukraine react to that?
They denied it again. Zelensky spokesperson called the Wall Street Journal story just a provocation and insisted that Russia was behind it all along. So Ukraine's still sticking to their story.
But it does feel like this theory, the Ukrainian group theory, is gaining ground in Western analysis. What's driving that?
A few things. It fits the physical evidence, like the Andromeda yacht and the explosive traces they found. It also points to a smaller, more secretive operation, not some big state-sponsored attack, which might explain why there's not a ton of evidence out there. And of course, Ukraine had a big reason to want those Nord Stream pipelines out of commission. By mid-2024, there were even reports that German authorities had issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian guy connected to the Andromeda. That definitely adds fuel to the fire. It's still not proven, but a lot of analysts think it's the most plausible explanation. But it's politically tricky because it means an ally might have messed with the infrastructure of other friendly countries.
Yeah, that could cause some serious diplomatic headaches. All right, so we've got Russia, the U.S., and Ukraine. Were there any other theories worth mentioning?
A couple more came up. In October 2022, Russia made this big show of accusing the UK, saying British Navy specialists blew up Nord Stream and calling it a terrorist attack. But London immediately shot that down, called it epic-scale false allegations, and Western analysts mostly saw it as Russian propaganda to deflect blame. That theory never really gained traction outside of Russian state media.
What about Poland? They've always hated Nord Stream.
Poland's name did pop up, mostly because they've been so critical of those pipelines, and their own Baltic pipe, which brings gas from Norway, started working right around the same time as the Nord Stream explosions.
Yeah.
Plus, there was talk of the saboteur's yacht maybe stopping at a Polish marina, and then there's that Sikorsky tweet. But there's absolutely no solid evidence that the Polish government was involved. Any Polish connection seems to be purely coincidental. So, yeah, they definitely had political reasons to be happy about Nord Stream going down, but actually being involved. That's a fringe theory at best.
Any other, let's call them creative ideas out there?
Oh, with a mystery this big and unsolved, there were some wilder theories floating around. Stuff about rogue CIA agents or NATO folks going off script, maybe Western energy companies wanting to jack up gas prices, even some environmental activists trying to stop Russian pollution. But none of those have any real evidence to back them up. Like one European security expert said, with Nord Stream, nobody's taking credit, so you get all these never-ending theories because nobody knows for sure.
So lots of possibilities, but some definitely more believable than others based on what we know.
Mm-hmm.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about who actually benefited from Nord Stream going down, both strategically and financially. The classic cubano, right? But just because someone benefits doesn't automatically make them guilty.
Exactly. But looking at who gains something can help us understand motives a little better. Let's start with the U.S.
Okay, the U.S. has definitely been mentioned as a big winner here. How so?
Strategically, the U.S. got a big boost because Europe isn't reliant on Russian energy anymore, and that strengthens the Western alliance against Moscow. There were real worries that a bad winter could have made some European countries, especially Germany, reconsider their stance on Russian gas. But taking out Nord Stream forced Europe to find other sources of energy. Economically, American energy companies made a killing. U.S. LNG exports to Europe hit record highs in 2022 and 2023, making the U.S. Europe's main LNG supplier. That meant big profits for American gas producers and helped fill the gap in the EU's energy supply. Geopolitically, the U.S. probably gained more influence in Europe, too, as NATO allies became more dependent on American energy. So the motive and means argument is definitely there. But, like we talked about before, you could also say that these gains were more a side effect of Russia cutting back gas supplies and Europe putting sanctions on them, not because of direct U.S. action.
It's an important point to make. What about Ukraine? They definitely had a reason to want Nord Stream out of the picture.
No doubt about it. Ukraine has been against Nord Stream from day one because it went around them, letting Russia send gas directly to Germany. That meant Ukraine could lose out on transit fees and political leverage. Ukrainian officials have said many times that Nord Stream let Putin blackmail or wage war on Eastern Europe without consequences. With Nord Stream gone, any future Russian gas going to Europe would probably have to go through Ukraine, so they get some control and income back. And hurting Russia's economy by cutting off that gas money also helps Ukraine's war effort. It's worth mentioning that every single Ukrainian and Baltic Sea state was completely opposed to Nord Stream. Now, if it turns out Ukraine did it, that could mess things up with Western Europe, but getting rid of such a big geopolitical threat, that's a huge win for Ukraine.
What about Poland and the Baltic states? They were pretty vocal about not liking Nord Stream either.
They definitely benefited strategically. The EU can't use that direct Russian gas pipeline anymore, which they saw as a way for Russia to exert too much influence. Poland, especially, scored big because their Baltic pipe, which brings in gas from Norway, opened up right before Nord Stream blew up. That made them a crucial alternative for Central Europe. Their warnings about Nord Stream not being safe suddenly looked pretty smart. And Poland also benefits financially because now they're a key transit hub for non-Russian gas. Some people have pointed out how convenient the timing was. The Baltic states also feel safer now that Europe's not so hooked on Russian gas. Sikorsky even called Nord Stream $20 billion of scrap metal, and you can bet they weren't sad to see it go.
Norway's been mentioned as a winner in this too, right?
For sure. They were already Europe's top gas supplier, and after Nord Stream went down, their role got even bigger. With Russia's market share shrinking, Norway's pipelines and LNG exports became vital for Europe, and they made bank. Companies like Equinor reported record profits because prices went up and demand soared. By 2025, Norway was supplying something like 30% of all the gas the EU used. Now, Hirsch tried to tie Norway directly to the sabotage, but remember, just because things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. Norway's gains could just be a natural result of the changes in the energy market after the war in Ukraine started. But there's no denying they came out on top financially, which has led to some accusations of war profiteering.
So everybody's winning except for Western Europe, like Germany. They lost a ton of money on Nord Stream too.
Well, yeah, countries like Germany definitely took a hit in the short term. Their investment in Nord Stream 2 went up in smoke, and their energy bills went up. But you could argue there's a long-term benefit. They had to find other energy sources fast, so they put more money into LNG terminals, storage, and renewables. It was painful at first, but this shift away from Russian gas could actually make Europe more energy secure in the long run and reduce Russia's power over them. And obviously, the companies involved in this transition, the U.S. and Qatari LNG suppliers, the people building those terminals, they're all doing great business. Overall, global gas producers have benefited from the tighter market.
It's kind of ironic that Russia seems to be the only one who didn't gain anything from this.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. Russia lost important infrastructure, future income, and all that leverage they had with Nord Stream. The only benefit they might have gotten is being able to spread suspicion and division among their opponents. They've tried to paint it as a cover-up and demanded to be part of the investigation, but that hasn't gotten them anywhere.
All right, so we've got a lot of potential winners, but that doesn't tell us who did it. Let's talk about the official investigations. What's been released so far? Or, more accurately, what hasn't been released?
Right. Germany, Sweden, and Denmark all launched criminal investigations, and they all quickly agreed that it was gross sabotage based on the traces of explosives they found on the pipelines. But they've been super secretive about it, saying it's a matter of national security. Sweden, for instance, confirmed they found explosives, but then closed their investigation in February 2024 without naming any suspects. Denmark also finished their investigation without blaming anyone. Germany's investigation is still going on, and they're focusing on that Andromeda yacht and possible Ukrainian involvement, but they haven't publicly said who they think did it.
And Russia's not happy about being left out of the loop.
Oh yeah, they've been complaining constantly. They even tried to get the UN Security Council to launch an international investigation, but that didn't happen. Western governments have said they'll only release their findings when they've got rock-solid proof. People have compared it to the MH17 investigation, which took forever. As of now, no government or big organization has officially accused anyone. NATO called it sabotage, but didn't name names. So we've got no accountability and a mystery that's still unsolved.
So, while we wait for official answers, what unofficial conclusions have people come to?
Well, like we talked about before, most analysts don't think Russia did it. The logic just doesn't work. And there's no real evidence to support the false flag theory. The general consensus is that it probably wasn't Russia.
And the unofficial consensus seems to be leaning towards Ukraine, or at least a pro-Ukrainian group.
Yeah, a lot of unofficial analysis is pointing that way, especially after those investigations by the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. The details might differ a bit, but the idea that a covert Ukrainian or anti-Putin Russian group is the most likely culprit is gaining traction. Now, no Western government has officially said that, and Ukraine's still denying it. But within intelligence circles, this theory seems to be gaining support. And the fact that German authorities haven't contradicted those reports about the yacht and potential suspects adds some weight. The unofficial conclusion for many is that it was probably a Ukrainian special operation that wasn't officially sanctioned. Of course, this raises some really tough questions about whether the West knew anything beforehand and how much trust there is between Western allies and Kyiv.
And what about the U.S. being involved? That seems to have stayed mostly in the realm of internet speculation and conspiracy theories.
Pretty much. No credible analysis has proven U.S. involvement. People talk about it online, but there's no real evidence. Even those NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea weren't near where the explosions happened. The Brookings Institution pointed out that Russian propaganda has been pushing the U.S. did its story really hard, and most European allies don't buy it either. They don't believe the U.S. would do something like that to Germany, a close partner. So most Western analysts dismiss that theory because there's no proof. And it wouldn't make political sense, but it'll probably stick around in some corners of the internet, thanks to the benefits the U.S. got and their past criticism of the pipeline.
So it's become a real geopolitical whodunit, like people are saying.
Totally. Every time a new piece of info or a leak comes out, the story seems to change. Even politicians like Viktor Orban in Hungary have given their opinions, showing how this event has become tangled up in all sorts of political agendas. Because there's no official explanation, all these speculations and conspiracy theories have popped up.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive, as of early 2025, no official body has said who sabotaged Nord Stream 2. But the most believable theory right now is that it was a Ukrainian special ops team, or a proxy group, maybe with some initial approval from the Ukrainian government. Theories blaming the US or the UK are largely debunked, and while Russia was a suspect at first, the lack of a clear motive has weakened that theory a lot. Official investigations have confirmed it was sabotage, but nobody knows who did it. It seems like we're in a situation where, like that security expert said, nobody's going to claim responsibility, and the mystery will probably never be solved. But the consequences from how energy markets have shifted to the increased mistrust between countries are real, and they're happening right now.
Absolutely. It's a major event with long-lasting effects, even though we don't know for sure who did it.
Well, that's the end of our deep dive into the Nord Stream 2 sabotage. It's a messy, complicated situation with no easy answers.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how murky and unpredictable international relations can be, and how hard it is to figure out who's to blame in these complex events.
So think about all the theories and potential winners we talked about today, from Russia to Ukraine to the US and everyone in between. Let's leave you with this. If someone can attack and damage crucial parts of global infrastructure like this and get away with it, what does that say about the future of global conflict and the safety of all those essential resources we rely on? It's a scary thought, and the unanswered questions from this mystery are going to stay with us for a long time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.